Are you ready to name that podcast? I'm Hank from Free Podcast Tools, and this time I want to talk about naming your podcast. First things first, I wish every podcaster that is about to start a podcast would head to a podcast directory and a search engine, a good search engine, and do a search for the name they're thinking about. This could save so many headaches. If you head to any podcast directory, odds are you're going to find a bunch of podcasts with the exact same name. And it is annoying and totally avoidable. So before you're going to lock that name in stone because it sounds catchy to you, do a basic search in a podcast directory or on a search engine, preferably on both. Remember, you want your podcast to be unique. And how are you going to stand out if you have the exact same show name as 5 other people? But yet you see it all the time. People not doing their due diligence and simply recycling a name that already exists. And if somebody wanted to get after them, they would probably be in some hot water. Another thing I do for my podcast shows is I buy the domain name. So I try to make sure it's an original name, and then I secure the domain name to forward to my podcast page. By doing those two things, if somebody else comes out with a show that's got the same name, and then they try to come at me, and I can show prior work because I have an actual podcast that's being performed, and I've secured the domain name, and I did my due diligence in the beginning by doing my search. So lock down the domain name. Trust me, it can go a long way to helping keep you out of trouble if somebody starts building a brand on that same name and then they come calling for you. Another thing to keep in mind about your podcast name, I try to squeeze in keywords that I want. So take, for instance, Free Podcast Tools. I wanted to have podcast tools in it, and then I added the free at the beginning because I wanted to make sure people understood that on that website, you're not paying me. I'm not a consultant. So it is free information that I'm giving to you, and it's all on my website, freepodcasttools.com. And now, by extension, on my Free Podcast Tools YouTube channel. So I have the branding locked down with the domain name, YouTube channel. And so when you see that name, you will associate it with me. But I definitely try to include relevant keywords, because generally when people are searching for information around the stuff I'm doing, they're going to include the word podcast. So now I have a relevant top level keyword in the name itself. And lastly, I want to say, believe it or not, there's plenty of original show names to be had. So yes, you may have to sandwich your keywords in between other words in order to differentiate, but there's plenty of names out there that have not been done yet. So personally, I try to stay away from misspellings or anything that sounds like one thing but is spelled differently, where someone would go into a search engine or a browser and start typing it, and they type in the wrong thing and then end up finding somebody else instead of my content. So I try to steer clear of that. Anything that could be mistyped, I try to steer clear of. But if you're looking for a podcast name, I hope this information was helpful for you. What are some things you look for when naming your podcast? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos from Free Podcast Tools. Thank you.